school, 7th graders, and teachers. My name is Mark Lance. I'm very happy to be here with you today, and I want to thank Ms. Caswell for inviting me. I know this is your last period before the weekend, and it's pretty nice out, so I hope the next half hour or so will be interesting for you. This is not my first time in this building. Our daughter was a student at SONS, as Ms. Caswell said, and graduated in 2002. I've attended many meetings in your school and many performances in this auditorium. It is my first time in front of an audience. The reason Ms. Caswell invited me is because I wrote this book, The Weber House. Originally, I wrote the story for our daughter, but in a very real sense, I also wrote it for you, 7th and 8th grade students, good readers, strong students like you. In fact, the 7th grade book club in a middle school near Chicago read an early draft and offered suggestions and criticisms, and they were a tough audience. Maybe you will be too. Anyway, it's a mystery set in Maine in 1996, and the protagonists are two 13-year-old girls. One of the girls, Nicole, our daughter's name is Alyssa Nicole, is in many ways based on our daughter. She's from New Jersey and ends up in Maine in the middle of 8th grade when her father accepts a job up there. The other girl, Alice, is Native American, very proud of her heritage, is from the Abenaki Nation in Maine, and is kind of an outcast among her classmates. The two girls become friends and have to deal with prejudice and superstition and employ the math and science they learned in school. Librarians are very important in the story. To solve a centuries-year-old mystery of a pirate's treasure. So how did all of this happen? Well, as Ms. Caswell said, after I got out of college, I was a cab driver in Boston, an auto worker in Detroit, an oil worker in Texas, and various other jobs, including a bleach factory, a funeral home, a dock worker, and a bartender. Then I became a merchant seaman. You know what that is? Did you ever go over the Verrazano Bridge on the way to New York, and you look down at the water and you see these big ships down there? They come from all over the world. They carry oil and cargo in big boxes called containers. I was a sailor on ships like that. In fact, I sailed under that bridge quite a few times when I shipped out of New York. Can't see it too well, maybe that's the best. Here's me on a ship in the Panama Canal. I was a little younger then. The next picture, which I took off the coast of Honduras, is just kind of a pretty picture. And then this picture, that's in the Strait of Gibraltar. You know where that is? Yeah. Straits of Gibraltar are between Spain and Africa, very narrow strait. Some people say I look like Ted Lasso in that picture, and I can't argue with it. The next picture, just to give you an idea, if you're curious, is what the engine room looks like. That giant thing that maybe you can see they're picking up is a single piston that they were working on in that engine. Everything's on a huge scale. Next one is a picture taken from the bridge of the ship in the North Atlantic, and those are the containers I mentioned. I think that voyage was to South America, and it kind of looks like Rubik's Cube to me. Anyway, included all those just because I think they're interesting. Eventually I came ashore, and my wife, Irma, and I, who's here today, had a daughter, Alyssa Nicole, who was a student at SONS. There's your orange. Here's some photos that Ms. Caswell took from your library. You probably know that. And Alyssa, our daughter, worked on those murals some 20 years ago. She also played on a soccer team, and I think that league still exists. It included girls from South Orange and Maplewood. In the front row, you'll see the girl with the headband on. Her name is Magda. She was a student here too, and she performed in a couple of musicals on this very stage. Next to her, Magda has her arm over our daughter, Alyssa. And the girl in the front row who's sort of reclining there with her eyes closed, her name is Zoe. Back to the orange. And her mother was instrumental in getting that orange installed. So there really is a bunch of connections between me and our daughter and you. By the way, if you notice some guy out in front of the school a week ago taking pictures of the orange, that was me. Thank you for not calling the police. Any of you ever been to Maine? Sure, some have. Okay. Well, that's on Mount Desert Island. This is a picture, I didn't take this picture, but I think it sort of captures what I was trying to show in the book. Because it shows the coast, the rocky cliffs, the foggy weather, and that's kind of the mood I was trying to invoke in the story. This picture was taken in, I did take this picture, this is in Maine. On the right is Alyssa, and that's on top of Mount Cadillac, on Mount Desert, which is where Bar Harbor is. If you've been there, you might have stayed there on your vacation. And that's on the morning of August 30, 1996. At 5:48, the sun came up, and Mount Desert sticks so far north and sticks so far out into the Atlantic Ocean that it's the very first place that the sun hits. And so on that day, we found the highest rock for Alyssa to stand on. She was the first person in North America to see the sun. So I don't want to give anything away in case you decide to read the book, but a lot of these things, an 8th grader from New Jersey, Maine, soccer, a merchant seaman, all figure in the story. Now the next picture is obviously different from all the others. That was 9/11. I was already working on the story when that happened. Alyssa was in 8th grade then. I was working a block away from the World Trade Center, but since I worked at nights, I wasn't actually there when it happened. But some of Alyssa's friends had parents who worked in the Twin Towers. Those students were in school. Cell tower communication was out, and so for hours they didn't know if their parents were alive or not. You can imagine how terrible that was. So what does this have to do with my story? Well, shortly after the attack, a new Harry Potter story came out, Harry Potter and the Half-Blood Prince, which I imagine some of you have read. A reviewer in the New York Times said, at a time when everyday life is increasingly charged with dark and deadly deeds, something like that, the temptation to believe that a good wizard is coming of age, a wizard who may vanquish the greatest evildoer, holds even more attraction. Well, I like fantasy and escape as much as the next guy. But I think some readers also want to know why terrible things happen. And I know you weren't alive, you 7th graders, weren't alive when 9/11 occurred. And it might seem like ancient history to you, but I assure you that it does not seem like ancient history to your parents. But you did go through the pandemic. That was scary too. Still is, actually. And there was a lot of false information and prejudice flying around then too. But I think the real explanations for events like these are found in history and science and not in magic. And that's why I decided to put some history and science into my story. I wanted to talk a bit about how the modern world came to be. And I also wanted to include some social issues. That's how Alice, a Native American, and another character, an old homeless woman, also came into the story. Here's some drawings that appear in the book. I'll just scroll through them really fast. That's a drawing of Nicole and her mother driving up to Maine. They're almost at their new home. Here's a spooky covered bridge they have to go over. Here's the spooky house that's rumored to be haunted that they move into. Here there's a tower nearby, and that's a view of the made-up town of Elk River, where the story takes place. Here's a scary wolf. This is kind of hard to see, but it's a view from the water of the same cliff where that tower is and where the house is. And maybe you'd like to check out the story, and if you do, I'd love to hear your opinion. The last point I want to make is about cultural appropriation. You familiar with that term? Good. I'm sure you are. Anyway, it can take many forms, but I Googled it, the term, and found the following explanation in the Encyclopedia Britannica. A member of a majority group oversimplifying the culture of a minority group, or treating the culture of the minority group as a joke, is cultural appropriation. It's not hard to find examples from movies when I was growing up. Animated movies aimed at viewers younger than you featured characters depicting African Americans, Native Americans, Jewish people, Asians, and Arabs in stereotypical and insulting ways. And it's not just ancient history. It still comes up in a lot of places, including fiction, music, and elsewhere. I'm originally from Cleveland. I grew up rooting for the Cleveland Indians baseball team. Their logo was a really insulting, cartoonish image, supposedly depicting a Native American. Only last year, after years of protest, they changed the name of the team to the Cleveland Guardians. The Washington, D.C. pro football team only recently changed the name of that club to the Commanders. I don't even want to say what they used to call it. As I mentioned, one of the two main characters in the Weber house is a 13-year-old Native American girl from the Abenaki Nation. I was very concerned to portray this girl and her family in a respectful and sensitive way, but good intentions are not enough. So I did some research and talked to people from the Abenaki Nation. When the book was finished, it was suggested that I contact Chief Richard Menard of the Missisquoi Abenaki Nation in Vermont. Chief Menard generously agreed to read the manuscript. After a few weeks, I called to see what he thought, and I can tell you I was very nervous when I was making that call. But Chief Menard said that he loved the book and his daughter loved it too. Chief Menard even wrote a blurb for the back cover, which I'm very proud of. He invited my wife and me to visit the Tribal Council in Swanton, Vermont, where we took that picture. To conclude, I don't work as a sailor or an electrician anymore. Now I'm a teacher. I'm trying to help people, some young, some older, none of them wealthy, who dropped out of high school for all kinds of reasons, who are now trying to get their high school diplomas. Education is very important to them. Here's a poster I made of some of them who came back to the classroom with their diplomas so I could take their pictures. I display it in my classroom to show new students that they can do it too. I mainly teach math, but sometimes I teach writing. Sometimes my students' stories are funny. Sometimes they're heartbreaking. Sometimes they're both at the same time. Very often they're inspiring and tell of courage and determination to succeed despite tremendous obstacles. I tell them that every person has a story to tell. Even in my math class, I urge them to tell their stories, to write them down. I've had students write about their home country, their kids, scary subway rides, about being hungry or homeless or going to prison. One time a student wrote about clouds. Another wrote about the smell of baking bread. He was just sitting against the wall of a bakery one day on a day like this, closing his eyes and enjoying that wonderful smell. Then another guy came along and said, "I want that spot." My student looked up and said, "You want to fight me over a smell?" Was that story the cure for cancer or for world peace? No, but it was great writing and I remember it today. I tell my students that it doesn't matter what they write about as long as they write. I urge them to write about something they feel strongly about. Grammar and punctuation are important, but they're not as important as putting some passion onto the page. I encourage my students and you to figure out what you want to say, to work at it and keep working at it until your story says what you want it to say. That's my advice to you too. Tell your story. It's been a pleasure and a privilege for me to meet with you today. Thank you very much. If anyone has any comments or questions.
Okay, everyone. I think the most amazing thing about Mr. Lance is his life experience. And when someone can transfer their life experience into a book, that's what makes it even more meaningful. So we have some questions that the students have prepared in advance. And before we read, everyone knows.
Okay, it takes a second for the mic to come back on. The students who are
Clapping, we thank you so much for the support. You can stop now. Thank you. Okay, thank you. All right, so we have some questions that the students have prepared in advance. The first question. Thank you. The The first question is, when did you start your passion in writing?
I think I always wanted to be a writer. I always like to tell stories, and it took, you know, it's a craft. You have to learn to do it. Ms. Haswell mentioned that I used to write about labor, about unions and strikes. And all those crazy jobs I had all over the place, I was writing then. And I would go to different places where people were in struggles, and particularly labor struggles. And I didn't pretend to be neutral. I tried to write from the point of view of the working men and the working women that were there. I was even shot at in Kentucky during a coal miners' strike once. It was a pretty bitter battle. But anyway, all that time I wanted to write. I wanted to tell their stories, and that part has sort of continued. And if you're really talented, maybe it comes easy to you. Nothing comes easy to me. I have to work at it. And that would be my suggestion. But to answer the question, I think for a long time I wanted to be a writer and to tell stories.
And what was your favorite part of the book to write? I know the students haven't read it. I'm reading it, and the book is wonderful. So without really giving the plot away, what was your favorite part to write?
I think it was the end, so I'm not going to tell you what it is. But it just came very easily. The first parts were, you know, I said I was writing when 9/11 happened. That was a long time ago. So there were other things going on, but the part that came the easiest was the ending. And I think maybe it was because I had been thinking about it. And all that time when I was describing Maine and describing everything else, in the back of my mind, I think it was percolating how it was going to end up, which may be unsatisfying to some people. I guess you have to read it to find out.
Now, in my introduction, you mentioned that you were working on a new book. Can you explain what that book is about?
Sure. The title has something to do with 1877, and this one is not aimed at middle school students like you, but maybe you'll be interested in it. Anyway, 1877 was a very interesting year, and not unlike what we're going through now. There was a contested election, and different people were claiming that they were the presidents, and it ended up being resolved by a backroom deal. And the guy who was elected, who was a Democrat, who should have taken the White House, agreed to give it to the Republican, a guy named Hayes from Ohio. And in exchange was the end of Reconstruction. So I don't know if you learned about that in school, but you will. It's really important. It's the beginning of a very dark period of Jim Crow racism in the U.S., and we're still dealing with that today. And so I want to talk about that, and I also want, because it has a certain relevance, as you could imagine, to certain political things that are going on currently.
How long did it take you to write The Weber?
I wish you hadn't asked me that. I started it when Alyssa was not even in middle school, and a lot of, you know, life intervenes. Coached soccer for a while, and I was working full time, and I put it aside and then go back to it, but I felt like that I had something I wanted to say, which if you read it, I hope you'll agree. It's not just supposed to be, I hope it's fun, I hope you find it entertaining, but it's also supposed to be thought-provoking. And it all sort of, for me, came together at the end. But it took a long time. It didn't get published until last October, so that's a long time.
Okay, and the last question for today. In your own words, I'm reading verbatim, what is the theme of this story?
Well, if I had to say it really briefly, I was intending, and this was conscious, was to defend the Enlightenment. And I don't know if you studied about the Enlightenment, but there was and it talks about it in the book. The students go and ask their librarian, what was the Enlightenment? And they learned it was a time in history when, for the first time, people were thinking that the problems that have beset humanity for thousands of years, that they could be solved by reason and by science. And I think that that is under attack today. And not just from some foreign country, but even here. That there's a lot of superstition flying around and it's dangerous. And so I was trying to defend the Enlightenment and point to another way.
All right, everyone, let's give.
Thank you very much.
Okay, students, so next week,